Good afternoon. I'm the Reverend Charisma Jean-Marie, and I serve as the Director for Racial Justice Ministries at Scarritt Bennett Center in Nashville, Tennessee. And let me say thank you for joining us again for another live stream conversation. This week, our conversation is entitled Raising Co-Conspirators. Raising Co-Conspirators. In this hour, in this moment, in this time, I think it's important for us to bring in our children intentionally, having conversations about racism, about diversity and difference. And because whether we intentionally include them or not, I want to just go ahead and remind you that they're already in the conversation. Research shows children as early as 6 months old can tell the difference in colors, in the color of your skin. And before they even speak, they're already learning whether they're learning from nonverbal practices in their homes around behaviors in terms of how you treat people. And so the reality is you're already treating and teaching your children to be a racist or be an anti-racist. To be a racist or to be an anti-racist using language in the work from Ebron's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so I just want to welcome you all. This is an intentional conversation, particularly 2 days before our election. So much is happening, so much conversation. And I also want to go ahead and name the weight and stress and anxiety that many of us are feeling about the future of our country. So it's important that we're having intentional conversation with our children about what's happening, about difference, about racism. And so who better to have those conversations than to invite educators, people who are with children all day, every day, who are experts in having conversations with children, who build curriculum around these very topics. And so I am so grateful. We have educators, a diverse group of educators from all over the country who will come and engage us this afternoon. Again, let me say thank you for joining us this afternoon. You're always welcome to participate in the comments, in the conversation by commenting with your questions or even comments right there in our live stream. And later on this afternoon, we will have question and answer period where we'll answer any of your questions. Thank you for having us. Justin, I'm so grateful for you for coordinating this whole panel with me and agreeing to moderate the conversation. Thank you for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sherzna. This is such an exciting moment and experience. I'm just so grateful that we're even having the ability to do this right now. So I just want to say, as a very just beginning, thank you, Scarritt Bennett Center, and thank you, Sherzna, for creating this opportunity. As Sherzna said, I'm Justin. My name is Justin Deloach-Clegg, and I am the CEO and founder of DLM Tutoring and Development, LLC. We are a small company that focuses on personal relationships and personal development when it comes to educational services. And so I'm really excited to be here today as I was a classroom teacher, and talking about education and how we have conversations with students in our educational system is important. Remembering the foundations of what that system is and how we got to where we are in this country based on funding, and how we got here based on the conversations and the norms and the expectations. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. I do also want to say we have a great panel coming up. So we have educators that are experts in the fields of special education, student activism, as well as Mexican American studies. We also have two PhD doctors on our panel who are leaders in education in their different fields, one at the university level and one at the secondary education level. So we have a great, sort of experience coming up. Just to frame a little bit about our conversation today, we want to be able to look at the world in an honest and important way. We recognize that there are things that are changing about the ways in which we engage, the tenor of our conversations, the tenor of our interactions. The news is constantly turning over these stories of, violence and just discord in America. And so as we think about how we fight back against that and how we support each other in the fight for racial justice, then we also have to start thinking about how do we get our students and our kids into that fight? How do we activate them as leaders in their spaces to be able to fight back against, these different initiatives that have been put on us? So I'm very much looking forward to having a discussion around that. And so before, I ramble on too much, I'm going to go ahead and start introducing some of our panelists for today. I'd actually like to go ahead and get us started with Dr. Andre Hoten. So Dr. Andre Hoten, if you could go ahead and unmute your mic and tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings you here to our conversation today as we think about how to engage children in conversations and activism around racial justice.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me join this panel. Super excited about it. Can people hear me okay? Awesome. And so I think for me, let me tell you a little bit about my background. So I was a classroom teacher for 6 years and I became an administrator. And now I'm currently a middle school principal in the Bay Area, California. Absolutely loving it. I think this has positioned me uniquely to be thinking about this topic, both in the context of students being able to advocate for themselves in terms of what they're learning as far as curriculum, but then now on the school leadership side, thinking strategically around, okay, how are my teachers positioning students to be advocates of themselves while also doing that in a way that empowers parents to do the same? And then of course, what does it mean to, I think, revitalize or change a system both from within, but also recognizing that we exist in white supremacist structures. And so sometimes that push needs to come from outside organizations. And that's a fine line. That's a tight balance to walk. And so I love engaging in these conversations, hearing from the audience, hearing from other panelists, so that I can walk away feeling like, okay, I know a next step, something to move forward to.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over now to Lucero Saldana. Miss Lucero, would you mind unmuting and tell us a little bit about what brings you to this conversation today?
Hi, everyone. Hola, ¿cómo están? My name is Lucero Saldaña. I'm actually a family and community engagement specialist at Bonham Academy, SAIC, and I'm also an adjunct professor of Mexican American Studies at San Antonio College. A little bit about my background. Mexican American Studies is a passion of mine. I actually had the first Mexican American Studies middle school course with my previous district, and now I'm in a school where we are definitely a blossoming Mexican American Studies with the Bonham Academy. We have a middle school course, elective course that is very historical, and then we also have a Mexican American Studies circle, and I'm also behind the scenes of the Conjunto course that we just started this fall. So, and then we also have a summer institute, which is Mosley, and that was a really big hit within our district, and we're trying to expand that as well. So having these conversations are really crucial, especially since we do live in a world where it's very black and white sometimes, and we tend to forget the brown. Like, we tend to forget the middle grounds in there, and also language. I am a former ESL coordinator as well. So sometimes we hear this instances of, Americans saying, hey, we speak American, we speak English in this country. And that is not the case. We don't have an official language, and we need to make sure that, we as educators understand that, and also our families and communities. Like, we need to understand that, you know, language is such a big issue here in the States, and we need to acknowledge that, you know, language is a benefit, not just one or two. I mean, if we could learn 3 languages and more, wow, we could talk to more than half the world, and that'll be really amazing.
Thank you. I really love this idea of pluralism and coming together and being able to actually communicate with each other, right? So I'm gonna next move on to Dr. Dusty Hicksenba. And Dr. Dusty, would you mind go ahead and tell us what brings you here today?
Sure, and thanks again to the Scarritt Bennett Center for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation, to be part of it myself. And like everybody else here, I come to the conversation with my background as an educator. My first job out of college was teaching English in La Jolla, Texas, right on the border, the Rio Grande Valley area, very South Texas. I work now as a professor of English. I teach courses in composition and Mexican American humanities at San Jacinto College in the Houston area. We're located, or my campus is located in Pasadena, but we serve the Southeast Texas region. And you know, I guess what really pulls me to this talk today is the phrase or the title, Co-Conspirators. And I imagine that's something that we'll talk more about. But when I think about that phrase, I think about it as a superior alternative to the word ally. I think that as when we encourage somebody to be a co-conspirator, we're encouraging them not to stand on the sidelines and to cheer, but to recognize that they've got skin in the game. And so the second thing that brings me to this conversation is the fact that I'm a parent, and I've got an 8-year-old who I think you all might get the chance to meet if you tune in next week to our second part of this conversation. I've also got a 2-year-old. And as a teacher, I often find myself in school settings, I often find myself in the position of being, you know, a white person working with students who don't share my background, or whose background I don't share. And so I think about myself being at once complicit in a system like education that has supported white supremacy, but also, like, as a teacher, really caring about students and really believing in the value of education and the possibility of education to push people to challenge that system. I think about myself as a parent. I have one son who is Mexican American. I've got one son who is white. And you know, so I think about my role relative to them as well. And so anyway, all of that together, you know, when I think about why I'm here right now, it's because I think about the world that I want my students and my children to live in, and that means I have to step up. And you know, I hope conversations like this are, you know, one way to do that.
Thank you so much for engaging with us today, Dusty. And finally, but not at all leastly, I'd like to introduce Michelle Bailey. Michelle, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings you here today.
Thanks. Going back on what Dusty said, like, thank you so much to the Scarritt Bennett Center for having me. So a little bit about me: I am a former special education teacher serving grades K through 6th in SAISD in San Antonio, Texas. I am now working in the financial industry. And so what brings me here is really, I've figured out, you know, I have such a passion for advocating for students with disabilities. And often I think when we have conversations around, you know, being a co-conspirator, right, race, systemic racism, oftentimes we leave out our students who might not be able-bodied, right, or who maybe and understand things a little bit differently. And so with that, I definitely want to keep that lens on this conversation. But more than that, I know that while I am not in the classroom anymore, I still deeply care about, you know, our Black and Brown communities, our low-income communities, our families, and our students, right? Like, just because I'm not on the boots on the ground anymore doesn't mean that I don't still want to continue to make a difference. And so I think this is a really good example of that. So.
Thank you, Michelle. And so again, thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. And again, can't say it enough to the Scarritt Bennett Center for having us today. So we're gonna go ahead and just kind of like dive right into this conversation, just to give a little additional framing. This is just a conversation, right? This is exactly what it sounds like. We're gonna be talking about and answering some really broad and open-ended questions that may not necessarily have clear answers. And so I want to go into this understanding that this is about bringing different ideas together and being able to figure out how we, again, as co-conspirators, working together as a team, can influence and build and grow. And so I want to make sure that people at the outset know that there's not going to be one sort of clear answer. There's not going to be a rosy, sort of outlook at the very end of this, or some sort of, neat bow that we're going to put on the end of this conversation. This is the honest facts about who we are as a nation and who we want to be, right, and where we want to go. So just, saying a little bit about that, I kind of want to think about this idea of children as co-conspirators, right? And as we think about how we wrap children into this work, fighting for racial justice in America, we also have to start thinking a little bit about what is it that we're bringing to the table from ourselves? What points of view, what sort of internal biases, what sort of things that we have been socialized or raised with that are coloring the ways in which we're interacting with race in this country, and the ways in which we believe certain standards about appropriate behavior, who is worthy of love and support and valued versus who isn't, right? And so before we can even get to that conversation with kids, we need to actually ask ourselves, how were we socialized in the United States? In what ways did our socialization lead to anti-racist or racist behaviors? Understanding that everybody engages in both anti-racist, hopefully, and definitely in racist behaviors because of the ways that we were socialized. So I'm just gonna go ahead and throw it out to whoever wants to jump into this first. Again, keep this very free form, but I'm gonna ask again, how do we question the way that we were socialized in the United States of America?
I feel like I'm always the guy who wants to break the awkward silence, so I'll go first. I grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I don't know how much you all know about Wyoming or what image that conjures when it comes to mind, but I feel like I was raised with a lot of stories about the Old West and the pioneers and like that kind of history. And so, I think that my position as a parent and my position as a teacher constantly has me reflecting on my own experiences being parented and being taught. And so I think a lot about how I was socialized through the kinds of stories that were shared with me when I was in class or when I was with, family members. And so I, as a kid growing up in Wyoming, heard a lot about family history. And my dad's side of the family has been in the Cheyenne area for a few generations, and big picture that was prominent at family celebrations and in my grandparents' living room is one of my grandfather in the early 1910s or so. Reared up on a horse with the family house in the background, and it's this real pride in the homestead. Now, when I look up that area, it's in land that had before that time been inhabited by other people, by the Cheyenne, by the Arapaho, by other indigenous groups, and that was never part of the story that I was told. I think about the stories that I shared with my family. I remember my dad and I sitting down at bedtime this probably took years because the books are so long, but we worked all the way through all the Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I think that there are values in those books, right? But I also think about the overall narrative that comes through there. And a lot of it is about white people moving west. That seems inevitable. That seems right. And the indigenous people who do show up in the books tend to be people who are like inconsistent with modernity, right? So people who are old fashioned, people who don't belong here, or they tend to be just depicted as violent and scary, but in all cases as impediments to progress. And so, you know, I think about like my life as a white man. I feel like a lot of what my story is figuring out the limits of my perspective and trying to unlearn some of those lessons about white supremacy that I just soaked up through media, through stories as a child. And not to, you know, be ashamed of those things, but just to think about how like I and my family have been complicit or have just benefited from white supremacy and racist acts, violent acts that have come before us or have happened on our watch.
I think
Yeah.
I would, oh, go ahead, Michelle.
I was going to say, I think the thing that I continue to think about is the type of language that we use to children to celebrate them. That actually, you know, and let me just give you an example because this is the thing that I'm thinking about. When I was growing up, so I grew up in South Texas and then I moved to Ohio, so kind of in the Midwest. And as I was growing up, I was consistently told how articulate I was. And that was the thing that teachers would tell my mom, how they would celebrate me. Wow, she's just so articulate, you know, you got a great gal here, right? While I was also the same little girl in elementary school who put on a report card that I talked too much, that I was too distracting, right? And so the reason why I think this is coming up for me is, why is it surprising that I am articulate? You know, and I can't help but think, you know, how many children were called articulate that didn't look like me? And so I think in terms of language, I often question, what are the things, right? That wasn't bad. The teacher wasn't being mean. People were trying to celebrate me, but what did that tell me in my kind of lived experience about who I was? And so that's kind of what I've got thinking about right now.
You know, after hearing what Michelle just shared and what Dr. Dusty just shared, it really resonates with me, right? So like, Michelle, I think you're hinting on this spot where even when people are, you know, they have good motives behind it, the language that they're using is highlighting the smog of racism and systemic inequity that they've breathed in, right? And I think a lot of times we're so excited, or we're so focused on pointing out other people's gap areas, like, hey, read this book or study this thing so you can move further along your own journey, but we often aren't as reflective with our past, right? And so I think about my own situation. I'm the son of Jamaican immigrants, middle class sort of background when they immigrated to America. And even though we're Black, and I share, you know, sort of the look of a lot of my students, my experience is different, right? I think about all the biases that I had based on my dad's perceived views of other people of color in the US, because our contexts were so different. And I think about all the things that I might have said to students because of my own bias. And it was like, yes, I had read this book and I had moved further. But until I unpacked my own actual past, I was in some ways perpetuating some white supremacist structures onto my kids, even though I wasn't meaning to do that. And that is, for me, I think, what is most terrifying, right? Like, even those of us who share so much background and connection with our kids can sometimes unwittingly push down these structures. And so if we don't also have these conversations and push ourselves, then I don't know how much we move the needle.
I completely agree. A little bit of background history for me is I actually grew up in Northeast Texas, a little small town called Mineola. Our area is really known to be really racist, sexist, etc. All the isms. Um, I experienced racism within my family in this small town. Even in school, I remember being in an elementary school and my teachers telling me I couldn't speak Spanish. But then on the other hand, whenever there was somebody that was Spanish speaking only, the principal or the front office staff will come and get me and say, hey, can you translate? And that will be minutes, hours of school. I'll lose that day. And none of the teachers will come up to me and be like, hey, Lucero, like, here you are. Here's what you missed. Let me go ahead and reteach you what you missed. No, it was up to me to make sure that I taught myself what I missed because they really didn't care about me at this point. That's what was going through my mind. It's like, wow, like these teachers are not really supporting me in the way they're supposed to. Yeah, they're saying, don't speak this language. But then again, they're telling me on the other side, well, we need your support because we don't speak that language. And even in high school, I remember being in Spanish class, and mind you, there was no other language to take except for the Spanish class, right? And I remember going into it and the teacher always telling me, hey, can you pronounce this word correctly in Spanish? Sure, no te preocupes, like I'll do it. And receive a report card where I got a B in Spanish. But even though Spanish is my first language, right? And just having those like mixed messages of like, what is it? Is it good or is it bad? And it wasn't until maybe high school I really started listening to Spanish music, and that's all I listen to now, Spanish music. And it's like I had to make sure that I practice my language not only at home but also through music, and that's something that I do a lot until now. That's practically my research, like music within academia, and how I also taught kids their language through music. Like even ESL, like I taught English through music at times, translated lyrics that was probably like a reggaeton song or a Mexican regional song, but students enjoyed that. But having those mixed messages made me the educator that I am now. And it's just really mind-blowing what our systems do in our school.
Thank you, everybody, for getting started on that. Those are such great thoughts and so much that I want to dive into there. But I would imagine that many of our audience members right now are probably thinking about a number of questions and thoughts and experiences that they're having. So I just want to take a moment to remind everybody, as you're watching right now, please remember to go ahead and type into the comments any sort of questions that you have, any sort of thoughts or experiences that this is bringing up or recollections this is bringing up for you. I do want to continue talking about this idea of socialization in the U.S. and you know, how we start to unpack some of these biases that we have in ourselves. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about the idea of where do we go to discuss these things in a way that feels productive, right? You know, we have created this space here today to be able to have this conversation. But when I leave here as an individual that's walking throughout this world, what are some ideas or resources or ways in which I can sort of engage with these activities of investigating or interrogating my own internal biases? I don't want to necessarily turn this into another book club about, you know, here's this laundry list of recommendations, but I do want to also feel like people are leaving with something practical and saying like, all right, like I can talk to my friends or my families around this particular topic, or, you know, how do we start those conversations? Whoever would like to jump in, actually, if you don't mind, just because I'm interested in more of Lucero's familial story. If you wouldn't just mind just kind of starting us off with this question.
Sure. I think as a community, we all have work to do, right? And some of it has to do with resources. like not having those resources, especially like within my community. Being from East Texas, I never saw myself in books. I've never saw myself in films, in the curriculum. And something that I have done through Mexican American Studies, I actually created a Google form or a Google Doc where I have a lot of like Latino books, specifically more Mexican American books and films and resources that any educator can really use in order for them to understand like the culture, language, and just like the experience of us being in the United States, right? And this also could be for parents as well. I know parents have used it before to buy their children books, which is something within our community sometimes we don't do just because we don't know where to get these resources, right? Now with technology, I mean, it's a little bit easier. You could purchase them online, but I will put that link in the comments as soon as this is over, or in between whenever people are definitely speaking. But the aspect of like culture and language, I strongly believe we must know who we are before we like grow, right? And for our society here in the United States, a lot of the white privilege curriculum only targets white people, right? And in order for us to grow as a society, we need to incorporate everyone else, because we're so-called the melting pot, but it sure doesn't look like it in the curriculums that we have here across the nation.
I was also really going to add that, so two things. The first is representation matters, right? If you are in a school that, that you serve students who do not share your same background, like I do think that there has to be some sense of ownership to go find those people who can come in, have a Skype session, or physically come in and do a lesson, do a read aloud, right? Because I think back on my own sort of the way that I grew up, and I just think like, when was my first Black teacher, right? When was my first Mexican teacher, Hispanic, Latino, right? Like when, and I have to pause and really think about that. The other thing that I would say is, I think what's changed in our culture is that vulnerability is really hard to come by. And what I mean by that is, I think that as educators, as parents, as people, we need to be able to be more vulnerable with one another, so that if you say something that you don't even realize is problematic, if you have a sense of vulnerability that someone, if I were to tell Lucero, like, hey girl, I heard you say this, can we have a conversation about that? Be open to having that conversation instead of feeling like, oh my gosh, Michelle's attacking me. It's, we can only do better if we know better. And there are people around you that we all want to grow together. But I think having that sense of vulnerability and announcing it, being held accountable, like, is important.
I couldn't agree more with what Lucero and Michelle were talking about here. For me, I think a lot about unpacking these biases within ourselves and that self-work. It's sort of a continuum, right? And I think it's helpful if people think about where they are. So in the very beginning, and it's totally fine, you might not have a strong sense of self, right? Thinking about who you are. And I think at those moments, my first piece of advice is like, go learn about your culture, read about the people who've made a difference for you so you can get a strong base, right? And so like for me, as a 13, 14-year-old kid who didn't grow up in Jamaica but was in the US, I needed to read books by Jamaican authors. I needed to listen to reggae music. I needed to learn about my culture first, right? And then once I think you have a strong base there, you can start moving into the next realm, which is, okay, now start to unpack your own biases by learning about people or subcultures, maybe even within your group, that have been denied representation and rights, right? So for me, as a straight Black man, or as a cis Black man, I think about what it means to read works from Black lesbian authors, right? An in-group within my group that has been marginalized by so many different organizations and systems. And then I think from there, you try to push yourself, okay, can I meet people who have had a completely different life than myself? And it's that research gathering. And maybe you're not even ready to debate necessarily because you don't know about that lifestyle. And so I think if people look at it like, okay, my own growth can come in stages and waves, and maybe I'm not ready for a political group on Facebook yet because I don't have a strong sense of who I am. And it's okay for me to not be ready. Let me do something first and grow. Because if you're not ready to jump in the deep end, might not necessarily be a good idea to do that.
I think that, I maybe look at, Andre, what your topic from a slightly different perspective as a white guy. Like it's very easy for me to see myself represented in a bunch of different ways on television, in music, on the screen at any given time, right? And so in my case, I think it'd be very easy for me just to retreat into whiteness and never even question that. And so I would say as a white man, what's important for me is to think about how I consume culture. And, I think that's the thing about socialization. It is so troublesome because it's constantly happening, right? We're constantly listening to the radio. We're constantly like you're walking through, before, lockdown, you might be walking through the mall, right? And like you just see TV screens and what's reflected, you're soaking that in. And so I think that, when you have your hour a day at the end of the day and you can sit down and watch a television show, think about what show you're watching. Think about who created that show. Think about what actors are starring in that show. When you choose to spend however much money to go see a movie, back when we could go see movies, think about like what movie you're going to go see, right? Like what, your money goes to the people, some of it anyway, goes to the people who created that film. And, maybe you could go see a film directed by a director of color as compared to, one of the 6 other films there that are directed by white men, right? And those decisions really do matter. As far as specific resources go, though, I think that one of the most helpful things that I, as a white person, have done is just try to fill like my Twitter feed and social media with voices of other people. And so in a way, I think learning about myself comes from learning what other people have to say about, my culture. I learned so much from teaching a course that involves like Mexican American literature and reading what Luis Valdez, the author of a play like Zoot Suit, like how do Mexican American characters talk about white people? Like that, that helps me see, right? Like how my actions, my life might be perceived in somebody else's, eyes. And that really makes a difference. I think on Twitter, trying to follow journalists of color who, read politics through the lens of race. I mean, that really matters. And I think that especially if you're a white person out there, you've got to be active in surrounding yourself with other voices.
I completely agree on that as well. We also have to make sure that everyone else is accountable for these actions, especially when it comes to the film industry, because we see that we still have a lot of white supremacy going on in the film industry, even in our book industry, right? I mean, we had recently a person of color write about a book about somebody from the border, like a Mexican American or a Mexican experience. And did they really know that experience? Yes. Did they do the research? I would say they did the research, but there were still some things that didn't really tie into the Mexican experience. So what are we supporting? We got to make sure that we're supporting our people of color. We're supporting those that really need that support, right? And that we're making sure we're getting those institutions accountable. They need to be accountable for this, because we can't just have another film or another book written by a white writer or a white director trying to emulate these type of experiences whenever we have our own people here who really have brilliant ideas.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to actually read one of our comments before we close out this section. I would love to talk about it, but I also want to make sure that we get to our other question. But a comment from one of our members. First of all, thank you for joining us today. I'm so glad that you're here. Quote, as an EFL teacher for many years, I've talked with native English speakers who didn't grasp the concept of English as a foreign language. Insight, I believe, needs to be invited via understanding that the world is frequently beyond our personal linguistic circumstances, beyond our own cultures, and different. Thank you so much for that incredible insight and so salient and important for our conversation. We're gonna continue to move forward because we do have so much to talk about in such a little amount of time. But first, I just want to kind of bring us back to this idea of co-conspirator, right? This idea that we're moving to something that is outside of the realm of allyship, and we're talking about what it actually means to be invested in the work and working together, right? Understanding that Dusty, as my white brother, is here with me in this work, and not just supporting from the sidelines, but he's actively supporting this organization or working in the same sort of spheres to promote racial justice. And also, right, having those tough conversations with our family members about who have different views from us about what it is that we do or how it is that we can move forward, trying to avoid this division, but how do we bring people in, right? So this idea of co-conspiratorship is important as we think about our interactions with each other, but then also the focus here today, how do we bring children in as co-conspirators? So I'm going to put this out to whoever would like to start here. How do we raise children to be co-conspirators?
I immediately think about the power of involvement, right? So, like, when I think about an ally, there's somebody that sort of maybe knows my mission and they like support tangentially, but a co-conspirator is helping me plan out the mission, right? And so, a lot of times with kids, we'll have a Black History Month, a Latinx Heritage Month celebration, and we tell them, hey, you're playing this role, you're doing this at this time. And that's like awesome as a step one. But for me, step two in making them a co-conspirator, saying, hey, we're doing this celebration. Let's give you some research. Based on your research, what do you think we should do in the program? What part of the program should be based on this or that? Or who should we highlight? Or how do you best want to highlight them? I think it often goes into giving our kids choice and involvement and saying, you know what, you're a rational actor. You're more than capable. You're a critical thinker. Let's bring you in and you can help play a role in your own learning, right? That's true advocacy.
With involvement, student involvement is so huge, and sometimes as educators we don't realize what the students can actually do to change the world. And I can tell you from my experience, a few years ago I had my students actually testify for the Texas Board of Education because they were trying to decide if they wanted to have Mexican American Studies TEKS. And I went and testified, and that's all grand, right? A teacher went to testify, somebody in the field went to testify. But it was really crucial whenever I had the students testify and had their own experiences coming from their mouth. That's when it all changed. And from then on, we became the first state from the state board of aspect to actually approve these TEKS. And it wasn't only for Mexican American Studies. They went beyond and they were like, hey, we're going to do this for all ethnic studies. So if you want an ethnic studies course, like, we can do this. You could have this class. We just need to build the curriculum, right? And whenever I saw those students testify, and mind you, they wrote those testimonies. I actually had a class of, I think I want to say like 25 to 30 students. They all wanted to go and they couldn't go because it was a star day. So I could only take a few of those students, but it was just amazing to hear their voices and the impact it made towards those people and the educators in the room, because we had at least 100 people testify, and those few students really made a difference.
I was going to add that I think oftentimes, and I even felt this way as a teacher, sometimes it's really difficult to say, I don't know. I think that in this work and when raising a child, having students become co-conspirators, I think we need to also recognize in ourselves that we don't have all the answers. As a Black and Mexican woman, I don't know everything about everything, and there are still some biases that I have that other people have to call me on. And so I illustrate this to say that I think it's really important to recognize that you're not always going to have something to immediately respond to your child with. But two, when that happens, that is a really good opportunity for you and your child to figure out the answer together, to go find a resource to answer that question together. Because they also will then take something from you that they don't know everything. And I think if even 75% of the world could learn this and could really internalize this, I think that we would be well on our way to developing more co-conspirators.
I love that. I've been thinking about, Andre used the term critical thinking, and I think that stands out to me as important too. We all want kids to think critically. That's in all of our standards. That's what parents want for children. And I think that we need to encourage them and give them opportunities and help them learn how to think critically about race. And how that affects people's lives. And, I think that based on my earlier comments about, the Laura Ingalls Wilder's books and such, one thing I want to say is that we have to be careful about nostalgia. And, that doesn't necessarily mean not sharing with a child a book that you read as a kid and loved. But it means making sure that if you do share that with somebody, that you also give them the opportunity to talk about the way that race is presented there and to ask questions, why, and not just gloss over it and pretend that it's not there. Another, and sometimes, I guess another thing that crosses my mind here is I often find myself, because people are so protective of their experiences, right? And like the things that we love. And, I don't think anybody enjoys feeling that this thing that you grew up watching or reading or just loving, isn't perfect, right? Like nobody wants that feeling. So sometimes I feel like I'm in the position where I'm like puncturing people's happiness, hey, did you ever think about this, that kind of thing, right? So anyway, I guess I've had to get a bit more comfortable with that. But a thing that crosses my mind here is like Dr. Seuss books. People love Dr. Seuss books. At the previous college where I was working, every fall, incoming students had to write an essay to figure out what level course, language course to be placed in, and the essay topic was their favorite book, and just essay after essay was about a Dr. Seuss book, right? These are kids coming into college. And yet there's a whole lot of research about how the Cat in the Hat is, predicated on a pretty racist vision of an African-American man that comes out of a minstrel tradition. And it's not to say that your kid can't love the Cat in the Hat and you can't read it together, but you have to talk about that, I think, at a certain point. Why does Mickey Mouse wear white gloves? That also comes from, a minstrel show tradition, right? These entertainment shows that would travel through the South. Walt Disney was raised in the South, and, you could just pretend that doesn't exist, right? Or you could show a YouTube video about it and talk about that. And when the cartoon comes up, ask, why does he need to wear those? And my 8-year-old, he can handle those conversations. And I think that as a parent or as a teacher, it's important just to ask yourself, am I sharing something just because I love it? Or am I sharing it because they can learn from it? Am I sharing it because, I want to share it with them and love it together? And what lessons can we learn from that? And we can't just, I don't think we can shy away from asking those questions.
Justin, can I add on to that just briefly?
Yes, please, go for it.
I think as I'm hearing the other panelists reflect, I'm also thinking about just the level of humility that it takes on the part of parents and educators to do this the right way. Because I think the moment you have those conversations, like here are the things that I grew up with, I want to share them with you, what are your thoughts about it? We have to sort of get off the stage at that point and recognize that like our kids and our students might go in a slightly different direction or down a different path that we might not even necessarily be ready for, right? Like they might call us on some biases that we have. And I think sometimes when we're in positions of power, that is really uncomfortable, right? Like we want you to help us as much as you will still believe what we believe. And here's this box that we're putting you in. But if we're really building our kids to be co-conspirators, we have to be okay with understanding like it might be messy once we allow them to think and draw their own conclusions. And I think sometimes we need to check ourselves and say, are we really ready to give them that much power? And I think we need to if we want them to be true co-conspirators.
Thank you so much for bringing that point up, Andre. And it's so true, right? It's so important that we are ready and prepared to sort of examine the ways in which our students or our children dissect us. And so I want to kind of, again, remind the audience here, thank you so much for coming here today and joining us, but please remember to drop those comments into the comment section, any questions that you might have, so that maybe we can get to it before our time runs out. I do want to kind of recenter this idea of raising co-conspirators around this idea of experiences. And so I think that part of what is important about what I'm hearing in all of your conversations is these ideas of about how we experience the world or how we experience certain things as we go throughout the world. Lucero talking about the experience of students going to Texas Congress and having that experience of discussing what it meant to them to have ethnic studies and Mexican American studies. And so I kind of want to refocus here and just kind of very quickly share, and then I'm going to open it up to you guys or to you all. I want to ask or tell about just this past couple of weeks, I've been working with my students at a high school here in Denver, Colorado, called 5280 High School. It's a project-based learning high school. And here we've been talking about voting and being engaged in voting. And so these kids are not old enough to vote for the majority of them. We have maybe 2 kids that will be able to vote in the selection. But even though they're not able to vote, they are able to have this experience of voter engagement. And so these students took their time and analyzed research and statistical data to be able to create convincing videos that they then promoted online to encourage people with valid reasons about why they should get out there and vote. And so now these students through their school have had this experience of what it's like to be politically engaged. What sort of research is necessary to create that video? What sort of practical skills does it take to produce a video? How do I work with the software or the equipment, things of that nature? And so this experience becomes something that lives on in a student and then gives them these skills of being able to engage further in this conversation. And again, we don't raise them as allies, but as active participants as these co-conspirators. So I wanted to ask a little bit more from the panel. What are some things in reference to giving kids experiences that parents and those who work with children might be able to do?
I mean, I think we've got a lot of things around us that really do allow us to have children experience the world with different lenses. So a really good, I think, example in Austin, maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, there was a women's march, right? Like the women's march isn't just for women, right? And so I think it would be wonderful for, fathers to take their sons to this march, mothers to take their families with them. What would it look like for us to ask, like, what do you think about this? Why do you think all of these women are here? What are they marching for? Right? There's also, when it comes to voting, right? Like being able to take your child in line with you and to talk to poll workers, to be able to knock on doors in a pre-COVID world when that was okay, but to register people to vote, to volunteer to be, when they do the text banking. Hey, help me craft some of these texts that we're going to send out together, and they're going to ask you, well, why are we doing this? It takes forever, right? And you can say, your response is what is the thing that they will learn from, but they are participating. So I think that if we really were to just take an outside look in, we could find many opportunities for this to happen.
I think another idea here too, to add in on to what Michelle said, is talk to the kids, right? So like my daughter, she's 5 years old, and she's interacting in this virtual space a lot more, and she'll mention different groups, or she's seen something on TV. It's like, hey baby, what do you think about that? Oh, you heard about that on YouTube. What question do you have? And then from the students sharing what they've seen, that could drive where you take them. So for example, we live in downtown Oakland, and we were walking to get some dinner, and my daughter saw some federal law enforcement, because there's a government building across from our campus, and she asked me who those law enforcement were. Like, are those regular police? And they weren't. And so for me, that was like a trigger. Okay, she sees these guys with guns. She recognizes they're not the same as the traditional police we always see. This can be a conversation about federal law enforcement, right? And there happens to be a museum not far. And so now when I get some time, I'm going to take her to that museum. And so I think our kids have a lot of interest. Figure out what it is that they're hearing or seeing but want to know more. And then you can actually drive your educational process through that lens, so that they're actually feeling like you're answering a question that they have. Because now they know next time they ask a question, they'll be rewarded with some learning.
For me, I also want to mention that whenever I had the classroom for Moss, I brought in a lot of speakers in the classroom, because sometimes we can't go outside the classroom all the time, right? Because that takes a lot of logistics, especially like planning field trips, buses, lunches, what time are they coming back? Are the parents going to come and pick them up? Like, what's going on, right? Permission slips. So it takes a lot of logistics to do that. So one of the things I did was bring in the community to our classroom and bring in those who are part of our community. Sometimes our abuelitos y abuelitas, they have that knowledge and they're not acknowledged for that. So bring those people in and let them talk about their experiences. And that way we can all learn together, because I know sometimes, I could be a really awesome teacher, but the students do not want to see me lecture the whole entire time. They want to see other people in that classroom for sure. And it's so powerful whenever others come in and speak to the students.
I was going to build off Lucero's point, actually. I'm thinking about, bringing speakers in, but also just the kind of assignments that you give as a teacher. And not everybody teaches English like I do, but when I think about the kind of research that I have students do, I could create a very tight prompt where students have to answer a specific question about like a specific text we read or something like that, right? Or I could give them the opportunity to branch out from that, to do research, not just by digging through databases, but by going out and interviewing somebody and bringing their experience in. So a paper that I am having students work on at the moment, and this is, Comp 1 at the college level, is students, we've been studying the word hero and, how heroes are constructed in our society, right? And now their paper was to go interview somebody that they know and use that interview to explain why that person is a hero. And some of them are choosing family members that, would not have fit like that Hollywood lens of the hero. A friend of mine is doing an even better prompt, I think, something I might borrow from her in the future. She's having students interview someone that they, and position them as an expert on their field. And so again, they're looking for people that they know and setting them up as an authority in their paper. So it's not just, whatever person happens to be listed at the top of an article, through, like we've talked about, a very biased publishing industry, but actually somebody who matters to that student. And so they're creating that knowledge themselves.
I just want to say thank you again to our panelists, Michelle, Andre, Lucero, Dusty. This has been an incredible conversation. I want to keep going and sharing and talking about so many other things, but we don't have enough time. So I'm actually going to turn it back over to Sharishna and ask you to lead us off for our next component. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, great conversation. There's some questions from the audience and questions I'd like to engage you all. Let me start with particularly Ms. Bailey. You made a comment earlier about the way in which people, particularly teachers, would say you're so articulate. And so here's a comment from the audience. I have had the same question. My flags would raise when I heard I was articulate or impressive, as opposed to what? I'd like for you to just talk a little bit more, and you mentioned this in terms of who else that don't look like me would have that comment, because I think that is one of those tools of white supremacy that comes, it's wrapped up in politeness, right? In that when we see, because it's this idea that being articulate, being smart, being talented are not often referred to or expected in Black and brown children. And so when you see one, right, it's like they're the exception. And that's exactly what, right, that comment is. It's not that you're just articulate, but you're an exception of a thought. So I want you to talk a little bit more about that and talk to the teachers, the educators that are here in terms of why those particular comments are so problematic to Black and brown children in their classroom.
Yeah, and thanks so much for that question. I think the first thing that really comes to my mind with that word and other words that we use, to your point, that kind of puts someone, Black, brown, Latinx, whatever, on like a pedestal to almost feel like they are kind of this, like a golden goose kind of thing. And the reason I think that it's most problematic is because I know for a fact that the spaces that I'm in or were in growing up, I was not the smartest person in the room, right? Like I think a lot about, my brother and how wonderfully gifted he is, but how different his life has turned out. And I think that part of it is the different comments that we received from our teachers. When you grow up hearing the same kinds of things, like for me, right? Like I was sometimes told that I was bossy for having the same characteristics as a male. And again, this does go back to the being articulate, right? That I find it particularly problematic because I often wish I had the language to ask a teacher, have you ever said that to a white child? And it also has me thinking of when Amy Coney Barrett was talking about her children. She was the language she was using for her white children were talking about their intelligence and how smart they were. But her Black children, that was not the language she used. And so I think that more than anything perfectly, describes the thing that we're talking about now.
That's right.
Why is that? And that's a specific reason why our language can really show and reinforce our biases that we do not even know that we have.
That's right. That's right. Implicit bias.
Yeah.
Dr. Andrew, I want to ask you this question, but anyone else can join in. And this is referring to W.E.B. Du Bois' white gaze. I worked for a college at some point in my career, and it was a predominantly white institution. And I would have my Black students come first day of class. They would come to my office and say, Pastor Jay, I already know I will not learn anything in that class. And I say, why? Well, I can tell the teacher will not teach me. And I knew, right, that what they were referring to was the white gaze. So oftentimes, implicit bias is not always verbal, right? And so the ways in which, if you would speak to the ways in which teachers can inflict, right, harm, right, to students just by the way they treat them non-verbally, the way they look at them. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the white gaze, the way in which white people can look at a Black person and already assume all of the stereotypes, right, that that's inflicted on Black and brown folks, right, that happens in the classroom. How are you able to teach, right, if you walk in and you see a student that fit that stereotype for you, right? You're already in some ways communicating just through the white gaze. So if you would speak to that, particularly to Black boys, brown boys, it happens with girls too, but you know, I'm addressing you because you're a Black male educator. So I wanted you to speak to that if that's okay.
Yeah, man, listen, that's a word. So I think about this a lot in the context of who our kids show up as, because that's what we put on them, right? So I can't tell you the amount of Black boys, you know, especially when I was a younger educator, they'd walk out of classrooms frustrated and come talk to me. And it's like, this person, they're afraid of me. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They either use a very different tone when they're talking to me because they don't want to upset me, but it's like you're treating me like this other in my classroom, or I'm as tall as you are, and you might give the other kids high five and tap them on their shoulder, but for a lot of our Black boys, they don't get that tenderness and they don't get that love because people sometimes have shown up terrified of them. Or even just little things, right? In schools, countless schools, we don't give our Black students the agency to walk how they want to walk, dress how they want. We lock them up. And I think the effect of that is they're dehumanized, right? And some people shut down. Other people say, you know what, that's what you think I am. Let me play that role for you. And I think it can be very toxic, and kids can peep that. They can understand that and recognize it really, really early. And from the moment they walk into your classroom, if you're a teacher that shows them that gaze in the first 5 minutes, they've made that choice. But one thing I want to highlight here, though, is we utilize the term white gaze, and I think that's key because that is generally the majority of it. But one thing that I'm seeing increasingly is it's a white gaze, but it can come from people that look like us too, right?
That's right.
If you know, I have a degree now, I have a couple of degrees, and so that there's a gulf between myself and some of my students, yada yada yada. If we're not aware of what those gulfs might be, we can be utilizing white gaze against students of color.
That's right.
You know what I mean? So we didn't grow up in the same areas. You know, maybe we're teaching in a place that's geographically different than when we grew up. If we're thinking we're further ahead than we actually are, we can be utilizing white gaze on Black kids, brown kids, even though we are Black and brown ourselves. So something to watch out for. Parents too.
That's right. That's right. And internal racism is real. Internal racism is real. I want to talk a little bit about racial trauma. We do work here at Scarritt Bennett Center around racial trauma as well, and I want to name that. And so would you, let's say an event happened, right, the George Floyd event that happened where it just really had an effect all over the world globally. It wasn't just this country. Would you all speak to ways teachers can create safe space in the classroom and offer a moment for children who are triggered by those particular experiences because if you're triggered, it's impossible to learn. Right? If you come in, and I don't think we talk enough around the impact of racism to children, right? To be able to consistently hear about the killings of Black and brown folks in our country, how it impacts children, right? And so would you all, anyone, speak to ways teachers, parents, coaches, adults can create moments and spaces for children to collect themselves, to have an emotion, to experience or express their emotions, so that they're triggering, that racial trauma is not affecting the way in which they need to perform in that moment.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that question, Sharishna, because I think about that from being in a classroom every single day. I'm actually in a weird situation where my school actually has been live and in person. We've been doing a hybrid model since the beginning of the school year. So going into the classroom every single day and seeing our kids after they have experienced one of these big moments, it is a lot. Like it is heavy for them. And for them to be at ages in middle school and elementary school and high school where they can't fully rationalize and understand and have the full context of what is going on to be able to self-soothe and get themselves through this sort of situation. And so I believe, as my role as a teacher, I don't know if they're going to have another opportunity in their life to stop and reflect and to have a discussion. So as a teacher, my move is always to say, this is your math class, this is your so-and-so class, but for right now, for as long as we need to have this discussion, everything is stopped. We'll get back to lessons and all of that sort of stuff later. But for right now, we're going to service for what our students need the most. And that's socio-emotional learning and education and love at that time, and being able to process this trauma that's happening. And so for them to also see that it affects you too, right? That there's not this wall between you as an adult or as this authority figure, but you have feelings and you are experiencing this situation right along with them. So I say all of that to say, stop, listen, and talk with your kids in these moments.
I think it's really important as an educator as well to, like Jay said, to make sure that, you know, our voices are heard during this time. I mean, in the classroom, I've cried in the classroom with my students before. Like that's something that I have done. And I know sometimes other educators have said, do not show those type of emotions because that's not acceptable in the classroom. But I want them to know that I'm human too. Like these type of events do affect me as a human being in this community. And for them to know that they're not the only ones. Like we as educators are also traumatized by these events. And I mean, it goes beyond, it goes to like the border wall, like all the children that are right now separated. It goes to also within the army. I mean, Vanessa Guillen, like a lot of people can resonate and see them, their family members be that person. And it just takes that one educator to make that change within a school. Like I know whenever we worked in schools, sometimes we're so focused on the lesson plans, right? For me, I honestly hate lesson plans because it changes for me every single week. It just did, depending on what was going on currently with the news. And like right now, I can think about Dia de los Muertos, right? We could actually honor everyone in Dia de los Muertos. We could put a picture of them in the altars to honor their legacy and what they have done here and the change that is about to happen across the nation.
Yeah. Dusty, I want to ask this question because you talked about it earlier. There's a quote that says, to call out racism in America it's like calling out America, because America is so racist. It's in our DNA. And so there are some cultural norms. There are some parts of our culture, not parts, the American culture itself, right? And part of being a co-conspirator is in some ways to let go some of the things in our culture that we love, that makes us American, but it's very racist. And you were naming some stuff that I didn't even know, I didn't even think about. The Mickey Mouse have the white gloves and just the way racism is so embedded in our culture, in our society. It's in everything. It's in our literature. It's in our history. It's everywhere. So I want you to speak to that, right? As a co-conspirator, why is it important for us not to just acknowledge it, but also there's just some stuff in our culture that we need to let go?
Well, that's a big question. I would, I guess like my broad answer here is that there's a whole lot of culture out there, right? And if I'm not going to read this book with my son or with my students, there are 25 other books right here that I could read instead. The book American Dirt that Lucero was commenting on earlier, I could spend my week or 2 weeks like reading that, teaching that sort of thing, or I could not and choose from, all these other works instead. So it's not like we are suffering from a lack of culture in the United States. It's not like if you don't teach To Kill a Mockingbird, you can't find 25 equally great books to teach in its place, right? Like that kind of thing. I was actually thinking, as you were asking your question about tying that back in with one of Jay's comments, Jay, you're talking about going back and teaching in person. I'm teaching virtually, and I think a lot of other people are too. And, I think that as teachers, we're having to let go of some of our ideas about what teaching looks like and what like engaged student behavior looks like. And, like we, among other things, inherit these images of like what a good student does in class and like how a student should behave in class. And, now here we are, a lot of us teaching in this virtual environment and, going a couple of different ways. I, for better or for worse, am part of this Facebook group of higher ed teachers who comment on things. And every now and then there's like this person who's upset about students not turning on their cameras, or like whatever teacher noticing that a student is appears to be in bed today, or didn't get dressed today, or might be drinking something alcoholic today, or smoking something that they shouldn't be smoking, right? Like that kind of like comment, and then wanting support from people like how do you regulate these students' behavior? And most of the time there is somebody in that thread who says like, why do you care so much, right? Like why are you trying to regulate people's behavior when they are at their house, when they are doing their best to get through this really difficult time that we're all struggling through? And my question is also like, okay, so like maybe they're getting high while they're in your class, but then the real question is like, are they learning? Because they might be. I don't know, maybe that's not even the right question to ask, but I think that, you commenting on white supremacy being just so fluid and just pronounced in so many sectors, I think a lot of that comes through in our teaching methods and our teaching expectations. And, I think that virtual learning for a lot of people is bringing those to the front. Or like some of the problems that people are diagnosing with that environment, like might actually just be tied back to some flawed ideas about what good students and good teaching looks like to begin with.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in really quickly on this point, Dusty, just because you said so many things that I feel like are important. This idea of like reevaluating or reassessing what it is that we expect from students. And I work at a school where students are also, many of our students, more than half of the population are in recovery. So these are students who have substance abuse problems. And so when, Dusty mentions the student that might be, engaging in behavior that, we don't typically expect to see on a camera while they're participating in class. Like that's something that is a very real, sort of thing with our kids as well. And sort of supporting students and everybody as they're on these journeys that we're on, right? Like reminding everybody that this is a difficult time and that we're all coming here and reevaluating these expectations. So I just wanted to say thank you, Dusty, for bringing that up, because that is so very real for my students and the struggle that they have. So thank you.
I actually was thinking, Jay, that I should clarify also that I'm teaching college, right? So, like different thoughts about like, my 23-year-old students as compared to if I were teaching 14-year-olds again, like that kind of thing, right? So, I know we're talking to a group of people who are teaching lots of different ages. So that might play into that as well.
That's good clarity. Thank you.
I'm muted. Here's a question from the audience, and this is for anyone who wants to answer. How do we do it in a school setting that does not support co-conspiratorship? So you might come with a kind of ethics, right? A teaching ethic, a kind of co-conspirator ethic, anti-racism principle, right, in your classroom, but you are in an environment that does not support that. So how you as a teacher, as a coach, as a mentor, how do you do that kind of work in an environment that does not support it?
I can jump in really quickly because I was at one campus. I wouldn't say we didn't necessarily support it, but I think the leadership at the time just had a very big blind spot against it. You know, unfortunately, we were very keyed into at the time turning around the school in terms of like just like test scores are what really mattered. I think in that situation, what really helped me, I was teaching 8th grade, was pushing kids to ask the questions, right? So it's like, hey, I actually do not have the time and the bandwidth to do this amazing unit, but I'm going to get y'all like these tastes, right? So like, I'm gonna read this document, I'm gonna share this guiding question with you. And it's like, I don't have time to go into it, but I knew if I threw those things out there enough and frequently, my students would latch on, right? And then once they latched on, they asked more questions, but not only of me, they would ask questions of their other teachers, the other parents, the other administrators at the time. And as soon as students started to bring that up more and more, we actually started sort of what I call a groundswell that the administrative team eventually had to take notice of. And it looked a lot different when you have 100 kids saying, hey, why don't we study this? Why don't we read this? They were a lot more inclined to listen as opposed to if I just went to them and said, I think we should read this. So I think depending on the age of your kids, you can leverage them as a toss it out there, let them get interested, and then they can sort of advocate for why changes need to be made. I think the power of students is very high. Lucero mentioned this, right? Like having her students testify probably was the game changer versus other educators.
Yeah. Yeah.
100% agree on that. Also want to tie in parents, family, and the community. I'm very fortunate here in San Antonio that we have an organization called Somos Más, which is Mexican American Studies, right? And we have educators from K through 12 to the university level, and that support really has helped us out a lot, especially whenever we have schools that don't want to support ethnic studies. And support looks different in so many ways. A school can say, yeah, I support it, here's the class, but if they don't give you funding, books, like none of that, then are you really supporting like the ethnic studies course? Because I know whenever I was teaching it, a lot of the money came from my personal pocket. I mean, this is my pride and joy, but isn't this what the school's supposed to be doing? And that's the case for a lot of all of us, right? In education, that we're paying from our own pockets to definitely be in this space where we want to be inclusive of other cultures and other histories and other perspectives. So yet again, it's about accountability for the schools and how we could bring in student voices, but we could also bring in parents, and we could also bring in the community, bring in those university professors, and they could, go to the school board and they could testify as well. Like that's something that they're willing to do once you have that community.
Ms. Bailey, I'm gonna bring you in. There's some parents who don't like or don't want that kind of diversity. Some parents, white parents, who might say, I don't want my child to be exposed to this kind of curriculum. I think my child is too young to be having conversations about racism. Like, would you talk to the parent who's watching today, who's trying to, figure out when is the best time to have these kinds of conversations with their children? And anyone can answer, but I'm gonna start with you, Ms. Bailey.
So I've always found it interesting that we don't give children enough credit. They understand way more than we think they do. They hear more than we think they do. And they also repeat. They repeat more than we want them to about what's going on in their lives.
That's right.
And so I think if we I think it's our own bias again that allows us to not share that with our children. And I would almost challenge that person who's like, well, my child is 7. So, you know, they are too young for this. But what we don't realize is, do you really not think that your 7-year-old has no idea what's happening to our world? Do you not think that your 7-year-old has not overheard something our president has said and has been confused? Do you, like, you know, for all of the things that are happening on social media and in life and in conversations, like, your child is hearing these things. And so you are the safety, you are home. And so it is the best place for it to come from is you, right? Like, teachers, we have such a great, I think, ability to connect with our kids, but at the end of the day, like, as a parent, you have that child forever. So I would definitely say, like, I think that we have to challenge ourselves in that and test it out. Right. So, yeah.
Just to give some more idea to the, or more credence to the idea that like kids are taking in more than we think they are. There is actually a very old study in psychology. This is something that they teach in Psychology 101 about kids and dolls. And so some of you may have heard of this, maybe some of you haven't, but the idea that kids who were about 5 years old during an experiment were given a preference between a white doll and a black doll. And even with kids of color, Black kids, they were still preferring the white doll. And so this experiment decades ago has brought out this idea that kids are internalizing these messages that say this is what's preferred and that this thing is not interesting or is not appealing. And so if kids are able to interpret those things subconsciously, then why can't we have conscious conversations with them, right? Why can't we then flip it and make it explicit and make sure that we're clear about, oh, so why does that actually matter? Why should we have more representation in the types of dolls or features that are considered appealing and hair textures, right? So all of these things happen at a very young age. And then just to go again, to go down the psychology rabbit hole, but also the idea of going even further back to childbirth and facial recognition, right? Kids are able to recognize faces within a couple of months of being born. And so if they are recognizing faces, the faces that you expose them to, think about that right now. You have an infant or a toddler at home. What faces are you showing them? And what narratives are you telling them about those faces?
I would also like to add in music in this aspect, like being really conscious of what type of music we listen and what the lyrics and the visuals for the music videos show. This is something that I actually wrote a thesis over. And the theory that I had is called cultural tune out. And this is where fans, in a way, are suppressing like the visuals or just the writings within the music video itself or the lyrics. I mean, you know, we all love different type of music. For me, like, I love Mexican regional music. At times I listen to it and I'm like, wait, what's that message? It's like, what are we doing here? Why is it so male dominated? Why are we talking about violence, right? And just understanding those concepts. But if we're listening to this type of music and we're not having this conversation with our students or children, then what are we teaching them?
Yeah. Well, I want to say again, thank you all so much for being here and sharing. For those who are watching, we'll be back next week. Next week, we'll also come with children in our lives, young people in our lives of all ages, to model ways we have conversation about racism and difference and diversity. They're already having those conversations, like you've heard. And so being intentional about having those conversations, it's important. So we will bring the young people that's in our lives to come to model what it means to have these intentional conversations, because we are committed to raising co-conspirators. As we close out this space, I want to offer an opportunity for you all to have closing statements, and I'll start with you, Dr. Andrew.
Thank you so much. I think for me, one thing I would just encourage all the parents out there to do is, I know this topic is scary. It is terrifying. The younger your kids are, the more nervous you probably are. Ask them those questions. It's okay. Michelle mentioned it, to say sometimes we don't know, but search out those opportunities. There's so many, even in a virtual space. Museums are giving tours. There's authors that are having free events on YouTube Live. You can check them out. Do those opportunities, provide that learning for your students, and through that learning, they'll have more questions, and those questions will sort of drive you down another path. It's like once you open that door, I think it becomes easier to figure out what the next steps are. And of course, reach out if you ever need any help. Thank you so much for engaging with me on this panel.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to go ahead and name the sacrifice for you being here. You're in your car because you're in the Bay Area, to my understanding, and you got hit by the storm and just out of electricity. And so you still sacrificed to be here. Thank you so much for your sacrifice and your dedication to this work. Really appreciate you. Yes, yes, yes. Dusty, final words.
Like a lot of people, I'm thinking about Tuesday and the election, and probably the few days after Tuesday as the results are finalized and litigated and all that kind of thought. But whatever happens, whoever is elected in whatever race is here, and race matters. And the longer we take to address it, the harder it's going to be. So I'm really glad to have been part of this conversation and look forward to continuing with it next week. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dusty. Michelle.
I just want to applaud all of you who are tuning in with us now and will be tuning in with us later, because I think you're taking a really important first step to recognize, number one, like I want to be that person who raises a co-conspirator. And that's a really big step. Mm-hmm. And so know that this is going to be difficult, but that you have people who are in your corner cheering you on. And I think I can speak for everyone in saying, seriously, if you guys have questions, if there is someone that you need to, a question that you have that you're not sure where to find resources, know that we are here to help you through that, because it starts with every single one of you. Mm-hmm. And so again, thank you to Scarritt Bennett Center for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Lucero.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's been a great space just to be here and speak to other educators that I didn't even know, right, across the country. I would like to say that, yes, I think the support system needs to be there for sure. Creating community is really crucial during these times, especially I'm just thinking about like my personal experiences and where I came from. Being from Northeast Texas, you don't have these people, you don't have this community. So maybe it's easier to reach out online, or maybe send an email out to somebody else. It's okay to be different if you're in an area where, you know, those perspectives are still being embedded, right? For me, it took me to get out of that area to understand what was really going on and what they were, right? The key terms, what they were, the definitions. And for me, I'm really supported by a community that really helps me grow and keeps me accountable.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your presence and voice. And last but surely not least, our moderator this afternoon, Justin, will you offer your closing remarks?
So first, I just want to say, again, thank you. This has been an incredible experience, and I'm so excited that we got to do this today and engage in this important work. In terms of being able to stay engaged, right? My name is Justin Deloach-Clegg, again, the owner and CEO of DLM Tutoring. You can find us at dlmtutoring.com. We are also available on Facebook at DLM Tutors and available on Instagram at Deloach Loves Math. Finally, our email is childadvocate@dlmtutoring.com. Again, that's childadvocate@dlmtutoring.com. I give you all of this information so that you can stay engaged and involved. At DLM Tutoring, our motto is every child deserves an advocate. And so I want you to work in this work with me and be advocates for children, and to work with us as teachers and as educators, and then even that greater community, us as citizens of this nation, working together to support and making sure that we all move forward together. Thank you.
All of your information will be in the comment section. So thank you so much, Justin. And before we leave the space, I want to read the statement from our Racial Justice Ministries as we enter into a election week. As we go into an election week, Tuesday, November 3rd is a very important day for our nation. Many have already endured long lines, the uncertainty of mail-in ballots, legal barriers, intimidation, and other such forms of voter suppression during early voting. Many more will head to the polls on Tuesday to face the same. So many are voting for the very first time, and many others have decided to re-engage with the voting process after a long absence because so much is at stake in this election. We specifically want to acknowledge the risk for BIPOC communities in this moment. This election has many implications for civil rights, racial justice, and women's equality. At Scarritt Bennett Center, these are all part of our core values as an institution. We understand that this election, like all elections, will define who we are as a nation and where we're going in the future. The stress of the day weighs heavy on our hearts. That is why we at Scarritt Bennett Center, we're offering multiple opportunities for meditation, prayer, and worship, both on campus and virtually. One of our core values at Scarritt Bennett Center is eradication of racism. We understand that the work of racial justice is spiritual warfare. We cannot win or do this work without divine intervention. So join us Tuesday, November 3rd in Sacred Space on our campus or virtually. If you're in the Nashville area, you're welcome to come to Whiteman Chapel, for which will be open for prayer, meditation, and worship from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And on our social media platforms, we will offer prayers, hymns, reflections, and quotes every hour on the hour for reflection, beginning when polls open and until polls close on Tuesday. While we recognize the magnitude of this moment, we want to remind you what Howard Thurman said, that there is always lurking close at hand the trailing beauty of forgotten joy or unremembered peace. Beloved, we are the hope we need in this hour. So join us on Tuesday, November 3rd for Sacred Space. Thank you again for joining us. God bless you, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.